Javed Rana is joining us now to discuss the latest developments surrounding this year's BRICS summit. Good afternoon, Javed. Thanks for joining us on NewsHour today. Now, the summit in Kazan marks the first gathering after the historic BRICS expansion, with oil-rich Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE joining. How will their economic clout and geopolitical interests influence the bloc's policy direction, particularly in terms of energy politics and Middle Eastern diplomacy?
Well, the geostrategic landscape on the world stage is effectively changing very fast. BRIC is no longer a kind of a side organization, something which the West has been portraying since long. I think now situation has changed altogether. It's around, right now as we speak, it is a 10 to 11 member organization with the inclusion of many of the Middle Eastern countries. But I think more than that, there are at least 40 countries who are on the doorstep of to be included in the BRICS. So this BRIC is going to be another bloc, and that would, at the end of the day, after 4 years, 5 years, that this is going to set a stage where it would lead to the demise of a so-called superpower, the USA. Now we have to see the bigger economic landscape. What is which country has what GDP? I'm talking about the great powers. That would be a bigger indicator in what manner the economic conditions would prevail in years to come, and who is going to lead this economic competition. As we speak, the USA has an economy of around $24 trillion, and that is their GDP. China has $17 to $18 trillion economy, and that's their GDP. Russia is far behind. It has around $2 trillion GDP. These are the indicators that the way China is progressing, the way China is expanding its trade, the way China is expanding its road infrastructure across the Asia, in parts of Europe, in parts of Africa, that is a bigger indicator that China's economy is going to be the lead economy after a couple of years. Most of the economists, they are more inclined to believe that with this pace of China's progress in the field of economy, China is going to surpass the US GDP by the end of this decade, by 2030. So that means the dominance of the US dollar is not going to be there. As we speak, as many as 30 countries in the world, they trade in their local currencies, in their national currencies. And the US dollar's dominance has from 100% to 90% to it has come down to around 59% or maybe 56% right now. So in a broader picture, there is a clear slide of the US dollar. It appears to be that there is a very fast process of de-dollarization in the international economy. Nobody looks at that bigger picture which is developing. Americans don't understand that even they don't have the semblance of being superpower. World has effectively now is a multipolar, where USA, China, and Russia they are the great powers. Yes, in terms of GDP, Russia is not as big economy as is the China. But we have to understand that in terms of military capacity and capability, Russia is certainly matching when it comes to the US military. What we are seeing now in Russia-Ukraine war, I think that there is a clear edge of Russia over Ukraine, despite all kind of latest weapons being supplied by the USA and the European countries. So in a broader picture, with the inclusion of Saudi Arabia, with the inclusion of Iran, that is an indicator that in years to come, these countries are going to be on the global south. And in global north, I think that is going to be on the sliding edge. I don't foresee USA to be as economically superpower as we see now after a couple of years.
Okay, now you mentioned the GDP breakdown of the countries percentage-wise. The BRICS bloc now accounts for nearly half the world's population and 36% of the global GDP. How do you see this expanding economic influence reshaping global balance of power, especially in the context of the US-dominated G7 bloc, which holds 30% of global GDP? Could this shift challenge Western financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank?
We have to also understand that the G7 also included China. So if we exclude China, I think then probably the statistic that you have cited, that would be pretty down. So I think when we talk about the bigger picture, the geopolitical landscape in the world, then we have also see the other groups like Shanghai Cooperation Group, better known as a SCO. Now SCO, by and large, is also included the same number of the countries and same countries which are also included in the BRICS. That is more of a kind of a political forum. And the last meeting that held in Islamabad, they also came up with a joint communique, which also dropped a hint that they intend to use their local currencies and their national currencies when it comes to the trade. Now, when it comes to the trade between Russia and China, both use their local currency, and that means the 94% of the trade between Russia and China is in their national currencies. And I think in a similar fashion, all these countries who are part and parcel of the SCO, who are part of the BRICS, now there is the agenda as we speak in this conference also is, like in the previous one, is basically to encourage the national currencies. That means with the expansion of the national currencies among these countries, there would be further slide of the dollar. That means there will be more de-dollarization. And we have to also understand that since now Saudi Arabia has allowed the Chinese currency to be traded when it comes to the oil, that is a big setback for the USA because USA's economy has been dominating. Part of the leading reason has been that the oil trade used to be traded only in the US dollar, which means the US was printing dollars, and it was, wherever it is needed, they were distributing it anywhere in the world and getting all kinds of production, industrial production, agriculture production that they needed. So I think in a broader picture, the interesting historical context is that the US became superpower on the debris of the Second World War, because by and large Europe was destroyed. Britain was so weak that it could not have sustained its status of being superpower. The Americans basically thought that by engaging itself in more and more wars in years to come, that it can sustain its status, and that is why we have seen that the millions of the people have been killed with the US weapons, with the US wars, particularly in the Middle East, particularly in the rest of the world. Mostly Muslims have been the victims. And with that, they basically, their war weapon industry, that progressed. And then that was also one of the leading source of their economic engine. Now, as we speak, there are again two wars. Ukraine and Russia, the Americans' weapons are going there. Israel's genocidal war in the Middle East, that means the American weapons are there. Germans' weapons are there. They are basically sustaining their nonsensical influence on the geopolitical scene through these wars. Unlike them, China is doing a business. They have come up a big economic plan where they are having the road infrastructure in Asia, in Europe, in African countries, and Americans are so disturbed. Every next day they came up with the legislation where there are more barriers on the Chinese product. Now, with that happening, that shows how desperate Americans are, because they know after a couple of years, China would be the leading economy. And we know that in terms of military, China doesn't have dispute anywhere else other than with Taiwan. Taiwan, it considered it's a parts of China, which is mean it's a more of their internal issue. So China doesn't have to have a war with any country. It is the Americans who are basically very active in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean. That is where the USA has built up a very loose alliance with India, with other South Asian countries, with Britain, with Australia, basically threatening every next day to China. Reason being is that the China is economically defeating the USA. All these indicators indicates one thing, that the US, whatever so-called leftover influence it has on the world stage, it would not be there. Then we have to also see that the US has used the Western, the so-called collective West. They have aggressively used the weapon of basically sanctioning these countries. They sanction China, though not at a large scale. They sanction Russia. They sanction North Korea. They sanction Iran. What has been the next result? Every country became more indigenized economically. They used their local currencies. They traded in their local currencies, in the national currencies.
Okay, so we've just had a technical issue there, talking to our guest, Javed Rana.
The growing tide of anti-Israel sentiments. What you see behind me is just tip of the iceberg of what is happening in the country. More than half of $52 billion black CIA budget is spent on espionage network in Pakistan. How would you handle it?
The US has looked upon Pakistan as an ally at one point and then as an enemy at the same time.
That is going to be the first legal reason on the basis of which he is going to be instantly ousted by the Supreme Court of Pakistan.
Joining us live, Javed Rana, who's an expert on politics and geostrategic issues.
In the world politics, which is not being driven by any moral principle, it is being driven by the hard geostrategic realities. In a broader picture, more countries would aspire to have nuclear weapons.